Okay, so today we're looking at the review by themes unit 4. Let me hide my view there. Okay. Um, Unit 4 begins with 1800 through 1848. If we want to talk about the dates or the events that align with those dates, 1800 would be the election of Thomas Jefferson to be president, which reveals a change, which we'll go over in just a second. And then 1848 is the date of the end of the Mexican-American War. Manifest Destiny, takes over at that point. And then we have the debate over slavery going in the next time period. But talking about Unit 4 specifically, so what goes on between those two dates there? In political history from that theme, the changes we see is that we have the very first political party system giving way to the second. The first political party system was the Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. And the Federalists were losing power. Now, if you remember from our class, they're losing power because people are migrating westward. And rather than being able to focus on the kind of elitist ideas of the Massachusetts regimes or the New York group led by men like Hamilton, you now have farmers out west controlling the ideas moving forward. And that is what Jefferson and his group were poised to use to gain political power. So the first political party system falls away. And one of the major events during the War of 1812, the Federalists do not like the war. They didn't support the war. And so as the war seemed like it was going poorly because, the White House gets burnt down, they hold the Hartford Convention to have several suggestions for what they could change, including the increase of states' rights, which is funny because they weren't for it initially. But as they get those Hartford Convention notes together and go to present them to Congress, the War of 1812 ends. The Battle of New Orleans was a massive victory, and the Federalists are left looking very selfish and too regionally focused for a growing nation. So as the Federalists die following the Hartford Convention, when they pass away, we only have one political party system from 1816 to 1824. And that's why this is called the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings is where Democratic Republicans continue to control the White House and all of Congress. Nearly every politician nationally would have considered himself a Democratic Republican. So when does this era of one party end? It ends with the corrupt bargain. In 1824, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, run for president. Jackson loses in the tie-breaking procedure to John Quincy Adams. And he believes that Henry Clay swung a deal to become Secretary of State, and he supported John Quincy Adams and helped him win it. So Jackson calls that corrupt bargain. He spends the next 4 years campaigning against John Quincy Adams, and he then wins the presidency in 1828. So this is what creates the second political party system, the Jacksonian Democrats and what will eventually become the Whigs, led by Henry Clay. So the main ideas between these two, the division between these two political parties is fairly similar to the differences between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, just under different names. So the Jacksonian Democrats were the champion of the common man. Again, those farmers moving west. Jackson said he was born in a log cabin, and so he aligned himself with them. And he also pushed the idea of states' rights above the federal government. He believed that states should have the right to choose. As we'll talk about, he was against the bank because that was too much federal power. He thought the states should control banking. The Whigs, meanwhile, were viewed as the party of the elites and the wealthy and the businessmen and the bankers. And that also leads us to the second kind of economic idea, the American system. Bank, internal improvements or infrastructure, and tariffs. And that would be led by the federal government to make sure we have a combined economic system across our country. So the debate over those two ideas and two main ideals leads to the division of those two political parties. And don't forget that a lot of people only joined the Whig Party for one reason. They hated Andrew Jackson. He was such a powerful figure that people actually joined the Whigs to push and fight against him. All right, so what other major political ideas and events do we have in this time period as well? We have the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That compromise is about the slave and free states. When Missouri tries to become a state, they apply as a slave state, and that would have undone the balance of slave and free. So in order to balance that out, we also add Maine as a free state. So we have, I believe it was 11 slave states and 11 free states. And then they also, to try to solve future conflicts, and this is a bad idea, we draw the 3630 line. Everything south of the 3630 line was going to be slave. Everything north of the 3630 line was going to be free. Okay, so that completely divides our country. And if you remember, it's the one time you really see me agree with Jefferson, and that he said, by creating a geographical line dividing our country, it will only continue to divide us until basically a fight's going to have to settle it, and that is the Civil War. So in 1828, we have another division between federal and state governments, and that's the Tariff of Abominations. This tariff, South Carolina, people living in South Carolina claim that it increased their cost of living by 25%. And so they said states' rights, states should be allowed to nullify, federal laws, especially tariffs if they don't support it. So this sets up a near civil war as Andrew Jackson threatens to invade South Carolina and destroy them. And so Henry Clay pushes his second compromise, the compromise tariff. Now, does this debate go away? The answer is absolutely not. We will continue to debate states' rights, and we'll also continue to debate the tariff all the way through the early 1900s and beyond. And Trump also had the tariff idea. So, but that fits in the main frame of this political debate, which is states versus the federal government, states' rights, federal government. So we also have the wonderfully exciting market revolution. Politically, this fits into politics because Henry Clay champions it with his American system. But the market revolution unites the Northeast, which was industrial, and the Northwest because they have infrastructure connecting them. The market revolution had canals and steamboats, and that connected the northern part of our country much more than the South was connected. So the South stays agricultural, while the Northeast and Northwest divide themselves, separate themselves from them because of their developments. We also have a continued debate over federal power in creating infrastructure. I didn't necessarily go over this in depth, but Andrew Jackson actually vetoed something called the Maysville Road, which would have been a federally funded road. So there are debates over whether the federal government should get involved in creating infrastructure. Other political ideas, which we'll go over in, this will be in the immigrant section, but the Know Nothing Party. As immigrants flood us, especially those from Ireland, Germany, they're not really welcomed here. And so we have our first anti-immigrant political party called the Know Nothing Party. And then finally, we have John Marshall's Supreme Court decisions. Now, I should probably type some of those out for you separately, and maybe I'll send that in a link later if someone wants to make a note and remind me. But John Marshall made Supreme Court decisions that frequently increase the power of the federal government over states. Let's see, that includes Marbury versus Madison, which established judicial review, but I believe that's actually before 1800. Actually, no, that's right at 1800. Then you have, I don't have these down, so they're hard to remember. Maryland, the Maryland bank issue. McCulloch versus Maryland, where Maryland tries to tax the federal bank to death, and he says states cannot tax a federal entity. Then you have the one between New York and New Jersey, which I'll send again. Should have looked over this earlier, where you have the Hudson River between the two states and a monopoly. New York tries to claim a monopoly in between those two states, and that leads to the federal government saying you can't do that because interstate commerce is under the control of the federal government. So political history, it's pretty safe to say there is a major theme in this time period. The major theme is states' rights versus the federal government. Do they have the right to control economics? Do they have the right to control slavery? Do they have the right to control tariffs? And those debates really shape most of what we talk about politically. The other major issue, of course, is the second political party system. How they're going to handle slavery is another issue. But the main theme of this is states' rights versus federal government as we try to figure out our new country. Okay? So if you have any questions, think about that, and you can ask me here in a second when we're done with the rest of the thing. So foreign policy, what major foreign policy things occur here? First, Thomas Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase from France. That massively expands our land. It nearly doubles the amount of territory that we have. It was bought for cheap. Now, if you think about that from a foreign policy standpoint, that gets us our port in New Orleans to allow the South to trade. It also creates division between our political parties and the Federalists. This is when they begin to see maybe we're going to lose power as our population moves west into those new territories. So our foreign policy has a major impact on our political realm. In the War of 1812, we have the Embargo Act, we have impressment, we have the Brits leaving for good from our country. Remember, they called the War of 1812 often the Second War for American Independence because we had embargoed ourselves to try to punish Britain and France. But Britain, remember, if you remember yesterday in period 3 or unit 3, they continue to impress our sailors. They continue to keep troops in our forts on our territory and also support Indians against us. So the War of 1812 in many ways represented us finally breaking away from the British. Following up foreign policy, a star you might want to put by this one if you had it printed out. Monroe Doctrine, we will stay out of European affairs if they stay out of our affairs. And this is our way of trying to solidify our independence, but also the growing independence of former colonies in the Western Hemisphere. We basically state ourselves as a protector of the Western Hemisphere from Europe. And then finally, one positive thing is we settle our boundaries between Canada and Britain. And we also have Texas annexed and given to us after they gained their independence. Mexican-American War we'll cover in the next unit. So what about economics for this time period? Jeffersonian America focuses on farmers first. You see that through things like Louisiana Purchase. You also see him embargoing foreign countries, which devastated our fledgling shipping and industrial groups. Of course, it also actually creates and jumpstarts people starting their own industries. With that said, Jeffersonian America tries to focus, or excuse me, limit the federal role in the economy. You see that continued idea through the second political party system because Andrew Jackson and his Democrats killed the Bank of the United States. The one way that federalists, or excuse me, the federal government had control over our economy, Jackson's able to kill it, which continues that debate over states' rights and tariffs. Do we want those tariffs to fund national programs and to defend our industry? Or do we want to favor farmers by having our goods cost less because there's more competition from international competition? So we have a debate over, again, states' rights and tariffs economically. South Carolina threatens to secede, threatens to nullify the tariff. And so we have a lot of fights over the role of the federal government in our economy. Then we have Clay's American System, which I mentioned earlier, the market revolution. And the market revolution is not just the infrastructure, but also we have a mass amount of new technology created, including the cotton gin. Cotton gin forces us to rely on cotton for our economy. Slavery increases because of that cotton gin. Steamboats send that cotton across our country. Canals connect those steamboats and cotton to all areas of our country and ship it much more swiftly to other nations as well. So again, we are more and more invested in it because of this new technology. That also creates some areas build roads because they see that travel is necessary. And of course, because of cotton, we also have a booming New England and Northeast factories who are using that cotton in their textile factories to make money. So cotton becomes the predominant crop, and a lot of that helps, it is both because of the market revolution and also helps spark the market revolution. Manifest Destiny also continues economically. That means that agriculture would continue to be important, also playing into the cotton aspect of expanding to get more cotton territory. And Western expansion is kind of the major theme for most Americans. Economic differences between the regions over slavery versus industry continues to create issues as well. And then one last thing economically is our regions develop specializations. The West and the South, as we may think of it, as they move west and in the South, cotton is the primary product. In the Midwest, or what we might call the Old Northwest, they were the breadbasket and cattle region of our country. They fed the rest of the country. And in the Northeast, they could focus on manufacturing and shipping. So every region has a specialization. And as we move forward, we see the South be a lot more separate. You don't need slaves for breadbasket or cattle raising or for crop raising like that. And you also don't need slaves for manufacturing and shipping. So those economic differences and those region specializations help lead to the divide that will lead to the Civil War as well. Moving on to religion, we have the Second Great Awakening. And while religion certainly plays a massive impact in this, and the idea of it focused on the individual and his or her personal salvation, it leads to groups like Mormons. It leads to a lot of people who preach hellfire and brimstone. But one of the biggest things to remember about the Second Great Awakening and the spiritual revival is that it created a lot of social reform movements. Those main movements include abolition from people like Frederick Douglass, those people like your kind of radicals, which we'll talk about in the next section. Abolition was a major part of the Second Great Awakening. We also have women's rights. In 1848, we have the Seneca Falls Convention by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they want their equality. We then have a temperance movement. The idea of teetotalism is not around yet. Rather, they wanted people to have self-control to protect our families from abuse. And then you also have asylums and prisons, led by Dorothea Dix. We were not treating our prisoners very well. We also get rid of debtors' prisons, which plays into kind of those political themes of helping out the common man who was in debt to bankers and the elites. But Dorothea Dix and other groups help fix or improve our asylums and prisons. So religion plays a major aspect in this time period in improving our society through reforms. What about women? Now, I just mentioned several women in those reform movements because the Second Great Awakening, many of those reforms were led by women, and that led them to become leaders in our society in many ways. Dorothea Dix, as I mentioned, asylum and prison reforms. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott lead the Seneca Falls Convention, at which they write the Declaration of Sentiments, which basically is their Declaration of Independence, written in the very same or very similar format with their list of grievances and changes that they demand. But that is basically what many consider to be the beginning of the women's rights movement. And then you have some of those utopian groups like the Shakers, created by Mother Ann. You also have the Grimke sisters. What I like about the Grimke sisters is they not only were outspoken women, but they were also abolitionists. And so they kind of fit the two different themes from this time period. The Lowell system I have written out there because it wasn't only young men working in factories. Young women who were unmarried began working in Lowell, Massachusetts in the textile factories there. And this is the first documented instance we have of women leaving the home to actually go into the workplace. So women have a lot of movement and changes in this time period. So this would be one of those key kind of time periods for women as leaders and pushing for social change in our history. As for African Americans, this is very important for them because we have massive debates about how they fit into our society, especially as it pertains to slavery. The abolitionist movement gains a lot of ground, or at least a lot of voices in this time period. William Lloyd Garrison was a radical man. He said we should not compromise in any way, that slavery was so evil that we should just end it immediately without any compensation or any negotiation with slave owners. David Walker was a former slave who writes the Appeal to the Colored, oh goodness, I can't remember the exact title, I'm sorry. I believe it's Appeal to the Colored People of the World. I feel so bad, I can't remember the exact name. David Walker, he called that they should do anything possible to gain their freedom, and that included violence, or at least was implied that violence would be allowed. And so both of those men would be considered radical. Pro-slavery, we have John C. Calhoun. He said slavery was, and this is a good quote here, a positive good, okay? He believed that it was beneficial for slaves because they'd been saved from Africa and they were given homes and they were given work and they were a lot better off, which brings us to Edmund Ruffin. Edmund Ruffin's main argument for slavery was that slavery was better than wage slaves in the North. Wage slaves didn't have housing, they didn't have food, they didn't have any kind of help. And so they slaved away in their factories and then came home to a worse life than slaves had in the South. And then Roger B. Taney is your Supreme Court justice who will play a terrible, unfortunate role in the Dred Scott case. And we'll get into his opinion in the next time period as well. As far as African Americans, unfortunately for them, they play a major part in the cotton economy, even though they don't see much benefit from it. In fact, it creates an increased demand for slaves because of the cotton gin and because of the focus on cotton. So for African Americans, even though we have growing abolitionist voices, their lives do not improve. And in fact, many more get enslaved during this time period. As far as the Missouri Compromise, Maine was free, Missouri slave, 3630 line moving forward. Slavery is protected in the South. So slavery was not going to go anywhere because of that compromise. So African Americans, some pauses, but again, with the cotton economy, slavery increases in our nation. As far as Native Americans, what do we see for them? In the War of 1812, Tecumseh and the Prophet, much like every other group, just like Pontiac, Tecumseh tries to unite all the tribes against American citizens to push them away and defend their lands. And they had the British to help them. Unfortunately for them, they are defeated, both Tecumseh and the Prophet. Tecumseh dies. I don't think the Prophet dies in battle. I believe he escapes, but they lose. And with that, they also lose their hold on the frontier. So you see there, Indians are no longer a frontier threat as far as the Louisiana Territory. Now they're there and they will continue to fight in small groups, but we don't really see a unified effort after Tecumseh by all or many Indian tribes to fight together to stop Manifest Destiny. And Manifest Destiny leads Andrew Jackson and others to focus on the Indians, and that leads to the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Indian Removal Act basically said we don't respect you as landholders. It targeted all the Indians, especially the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminoles, and it forced them to leave. Those who tried to stay were forced onto things like the Cherokee were the Trail of Tears, where they were forced to march and lose about a quarter of their entire tribe. After they leave, they then settle in Oklahoma on reservations. So a major chapter for Indians or Native Americans in this time period, as they not only lose their British allies, they're no longer a threat and are removed from many areas. As far as immigration this time period, the market revolution provided a lot of opportunity for immigrants. And so we see massive amounts of groups of Germans and Irish coming to America in the 1840s. Germans typically moved northwest. They had more money, they were Protestant, and they liked their communities better. But basically they came over better off, so they were able to purchase land and move out west. That's why my wife's family, who lives in Kansas, has a lot of kind of German heritage, and my mother-in-law has a lot of German dishes that she cooks, but a lot of that is because Germans moved out west and settled. The Irish, meanwhile, because they came from poorer circumstances and more desperate circumstances, the Irish tended to settle in cities where they could take whatever job was available. So because they're both challenging for jobs in those industries against regular, I guess what we consider native, quote, native-born Americans, because of that, their Catholic faith and the drinking that they were known for, a lot of groups in America want to get rid of them. Now, I would argue primarily it's economic. They're challenging for jobs, and Americans don't like that. But their Catholic faith and their drinking, their cultural differences, leads to them to be also discriminated against more. So this leads to that political party, which I mentioned earlier, the Know Nothings, the very first political party trying to stop Irish and other immigrant groups from gaining a foothold here. And then the last one, we've already talked a good bit about some of this, but you have the cotton gin creating cotton gin creates the cotton and slave economy. Sam Slater steals plans from Britain, brings them back, and creates our factory system. That's why he's called the father of the American factory system, because he stole plans. And then Eli Whitney creates interchangeable parts, which also helps industry, because if you can create assembly lines of some kind, then you can create a lot more products. So combine that with the steamboat and the Erie canals and other canals connecting our country, we have the market revolution. Now, one last thing about the market revolution, remember, it's not just connecting all the markets together. It's not just new technology in the cotton economy. It's also the idea that we are now more connected as people to other areas of the world. And then one last thing is that it brings workers, men mostly, out of the home to work in the factory, and creates the home as kind of an escape from an industrial world. So the market changes in many ways. And I would probably suggest going and finding some readings over the market revolution. Okay, so that kind of ends the recorded part of this presentation. So let's go over some questions.